By the time the federal judge's order slid out of the overnight envelope and landed on my kitchen table like a clean blade, my yard had already learned a new language. It could read orange cones arranged in officious triangles and understand plastic chain linked between temporary posts like a sentence that ended with my name crossed out. My name is Daniel Rhodes. I build staircases for a living, the kind that solve problems in 3 dimensions and creak only when they have a secret to tell. I live in Cedar Ridge, Texas, just outside Dallas, on a street where live oaks lean over asphalt like old friends and summer smells like mesquite and sunscreen. When we moved in, the lot line was a thin, quiet thing. 2 rebar pins, a string I stretched myself the way my father taught me, a handshake with the neighbor who swore by the barbecue he would never cross it without asking. That neighbor moved. The mayor moved in. At first, the novelty felt like civic pride with a driveway. Mayor Buckley Granger was a handshake and a white smile at the homecoming parade. The kind of man who knew the names of your children and your lumber yard. He waved from his porch with a tumbler in his hand, and he brought over ribs a little too sweet. He told me the city was leaning in to small business. He told my wife, Carrie, the park lights would be fixed by Friday. He told everybody exactly what they wanted to hear with the easy fluency of a man who had never had to unlearn himself. I did not vote for him. I did not vote against him either. I was a man who built stairs and cut grass. The first trespass looked like courtesy. "Do you mind if my driver uses your side for a minute?" he asked one evening when the cul-de-sac was clotted with donors and linen. I minded, but the minute was already happening, a long black car kissing my lawn. A week later, a city pickup truck rolled 2 tires across my St. Augustine like it belonged to a map rather than a man. The driver apologized with a shrug, the way a man apologizes for the weather. "My bad, boss." I reseeded the ruts and told myself that neighborly patience was the oil that kept a street from burning, but patience dries out when it is set on fire. The morning that turned the language of my yard into signage began with diesel and a throat of backup beeping. I stepped outside in my work pants and saw 2 skid steers nosing against my fence like cattle that had learned a new script. A laminated city permit flapped from my mailbox with the mayor's signature, and someone had staked a saw-cut rectangle across the back third of my property with white paint, as if geometry were louder than ownership. The signs went in next. Reserved parking, city staff. The ink still smelled like arrogance. I followed the paint back to the rebar pin I had set with my brother-in-law after closing. It had not moved. The paint had. "Who authorized this?" I asked the man at the wheel. He wore a municipal badge and a look that said middle management had woken early just to bless him. "Temporary expansion for public service," he said, as if the word public included my deck, my basil, my son's wiffle ball diamond, everything except my consent. There are moments when outrage is useless because it does not fit the form. The form, it turns out, is paper. I took photographs from every angle. I sketched distances with a carpenter's tape. I dug around the old pin like an archaeologist who loved only inches. I found the survey my title company had tucked into the back pocket of our closing folder under a menu from Whataburger. Meets and bounds, lines and bearings. The quiet poetry of a claim. I exhaled and felt the breath not in my throat. By afternoon, the space where my son practiced his little league swing was crushed into an asphalt promise. 5 cars slid onto it and glistened like lies in the sun. The mayor came home at 6 in a jacket the color of new money. He stepped out grinning like a billboard. "Daniel," he said, "I am glad you are here. This is going to help everyone. We are short on staff spaces with the new annex, and we had a right-of-way issue we resolved. We will do a little landscaping on your side as a thank you. I told my office to send you a bottle." I asked him to show me the right-of-way. He gestured toward the laminated permit. I pointed to my survey instead. His smile did something small and reptilian. "I have a city attorney," he said, "and I have voters. Let us not make this bigger than it is." He clapped my shoulder like a man closing a door. I wanted to scream. I did something worse for him. I took measurements again. Carrie stood with a dish towel in her hands and watched the street fill with staff cars that left coffee cups and the smell of other people's hours on our grass. "Maybe it is temporary," she said, which is a word that can mean 2 weeks or until your life speaks a different language. My neighbor on the other side lifted a hand in solidarity and lowered it in fear. He made a joke about politics being parking, not policy. That night I could not sleep. I did math. I calculated square feet stolen and estimated replacement costs. I found the county recorder's website and fell into it the way a man falls into a creek he had thought was shallow. Deeds and dedications, maps and amendments, giddy phrases like abandonment of easement and quiet title. The law had a scent like a tool room after a thunderstorm. Cold iron, oiled patience. It smelled like something I could use. The letter came 3 days later by certified mail, stamped with the elegance of bureaucracy. A notice of boundary adjustment, it was called, though nothing about it felt adjusted. It claimed the city had corrected an old plat line, and that a sliver of my yard, which the mayor's permit had treated like friendly fire, was now dedicated to the public good. There was a paragraph about temporary necessity. There was a paragraph about amicable resolutions. There was no paragraph about consent. At the bottom, the mayor's signature lounged over his typed name like a cat on a warm hood. Neighbor revenge does not always begin with a plan. Sometimes it begins with a quiet, stubborn refusal to translate someone else's grammar. I placed the letter next to the survey and slid both under the lamp. I felt the weight of what I had built in the world, boards and promises, and I thought of my father's voice the first time he taught me to check a string line. Trust the line, he had said, not the mouth. Outside, the city staff cars winked under our oak like beetles. Somewhere far off, thunder arranged itself. On the screen of my laptop, a phrase from a case popped into focus like a nailhead catching light, taking without just compensation. I did not feel like a firebrand. I felt like a man who was about to insist that grass can read just fine. In the morning, I bought flagging tape from the feed store and a tripod for my old camera. I set the tripod at the corner pin and aimed it like a witness. The red light blinked through the heat shimmer. I walked the boundary with a yellow notepad, writing down distances to fence posts, to the oak, to the corner of the deck I had built with my own stubborn hands. I said the bearings out loud, northeast by north, like prayers that tasted of iron. The mayor left for City Hall in a convoy of deference. His driver did not look at me. That helped. If you want to hurt a man with power in America, you do not raise your voice. You raise documents. I called the title insurance company and opened a claim for boundary encroachment. The adjuster, a woman with a voice like boxwood, asked for my survey and photographs. I sent everything in a single message with timestamps that could have testified in church. "We will assign counsel," she said with dry relief, as if a problem existed she had been waiting to solve. I hired a licensed surveyor to perform an American Land Title Association survey, the gold standard my banker friend once called it, while flexing a thumb over brisket. The crew came with a robotic total station that made the street look like a science fiction set where the only monster was math. They found the old pins with a metal detector, hammered witness stakes, snapped chalk lines that made geometry visible enough to step over. The line the city had painted onto my grass was wrong by 9 feet 3 inches on one end and 8 feet 5 inches on the other, which made it not a line, but a lie. I filed an open records request under our state's transparency law for every email, text message, and meeting note that mentioned the words parking expansion, staff, right-of-way, or my address. I paid the modest fee with a check and a smile, as if I were buying a fairground ticket. At night, while Carrie slept, I built a dossier with the careful misery of a man who understands that time is a tool. Screenshots, parcel maps, a list of license plate numbers that visited my stolen sliver. I printed each page and slid it into a binder, page protectors whispering like rain. This was the kind of neighbor revenge that has a spine and a table of contents. The first leak, literal this time, arrived with a storm. The new asphalt held water the way arrogance holds advice. It slid black and oily toward the little creek behind our yard, the one that runs behind the street like a child's secret. I watched the water pick up sheen under my flashlight and felt a small righteous fury expand in my chest. The Clean Water Act is not poetry, but that night it sang. I recorded the water rushing off a surface that did not exist last week, carrying with it whatever a city staff car leaves behind. I called the State Environmental Quality Hotline and used plain words: unauthorized discharge, stormwater pollution, absence of a stormwater management plan. I emailed the Environmental Protection Agency regional office, because if you are going to speak law to a problem, start with the loudest diction you can find. The mayor's charm worked on people who love rooms and applause. It failed in the presence of forms. An inspector from the state arrived wearing boots and skepticism. He crouched by the creek and dipped a strip of something chemical into the sheen. He asked for the permit that governed runoff, the stormwater prevention plan. The city manager, who had come to smile professionally, had nothing to show him but optimism. The inspector wrote on a pad with the slow pleasure of a man counting the cost of someone else's story. A week later, a letter stamped with a seal landed at City Hall, and the mayor's phone learned a new verb: compliance. While the city mopped up that mess, I served another. My attorney, courtesy of title insurance, filed a lawsuit in the county courthouse naming the city and seeking a temporary restraining order to halt any further use of the stolen strip. We asked for a declaratory judgment affirming my boundary. We asked for damages. We asked for an accounting of every parking space that had rested on my land, like a ledger of trespass. More importantly, we filed a claim in federal court under Title 42 of the United States Code, Section 1983, asserting that the city, through the mayor, had deprived me of property without due process of law. The phrase is dry until it touches your grass. We also recorded a notice called a lease pendens with the county clerk, which is Latin for "do not pretend you did not know." It attached to any title search that touched my parcel or the little cul-de-sac addition the city had quietly filed, and it said, in effect, that the land was a question mark you would not want to buy without a lawyer standing on either side of you with a dictionary and a flashlight. The carpenter in me kept building. I bought a small weatherproof box and a solar panel online and installed a license plate recognition camera at the very edge of the true boundary line. Each time a car crossed, the camera read its face and logged time to the second. I set up a private page where the entries marched in order like recruits. When the city's insurance carrier called, because of course there is an insurance carrier for everything that bleeds money, I shared the link. The man on the phone grew quiet in a way that sounded like recalculation. He asked me to hold. It was the sound of subrogation waking up. Neighbors stopped me at the mailbox with split loyalties. One asked if I could be less intense for the sake of the street. Another pressed my shoulder and whispered that the mayor's fundraiser had spilled beer on her bluebonnets and laughed. Fear and appetite make a complicated choir. I nodded, and I went home and added their little stories to my binder, each anecdote labeled with date and time, as if gossip were data. In a way, it is. The mayor tried conversation. He arrived one evening with a cheap Bordeaux and a sermonette about how cities are complex organisms. I told him my yard was not an organ he could borrow to make his organism breathe. He smiled and explained that the words temporary necessity carry weight. I told him the Fifth Amendment carries more. He tried to impress upon me the cost of this course. I told him I already knew the cost of asphalt by the square foot, and that my camera knew the cost of each day if a court decided to charge rent. By week's end, the state inspector returned with a colleague and issued a notice of violation requiring the city to install stormwater controls and to cease discharge into the creek until compliance could be demonstrated. They took photographs. They spoke in a language that is colder than politics. Measurements, standards, consent decrees. My camera kept reading plates. My surveyor filed his official plat. My attorney hand-delivered motions to the courthouse. The electronic municipal market access website, where municipal bond disclosures live like fish in a bright tank, lit up with a supplemental filing from the city acknowledging a dispute over a minor parcel related to staff parking expansion. Minor parcel. I tasted the words, and they were chalk. That night, I cleared a space in my garage and began to build a board. Red string, maps, printouts, notes. Not because I believed in conspiracy, but because conspiracies believe in the dark, and I wanted everything in the light. In the center, I pinned a photograph of the mayor cutting the ribbon at the annex with his teeth arranged like a promise. Around him, I braided the agencies and actors: Title Insurance Council, County Clerk, State Environmental Quality, Environmental Protection Agency, Federal District Court, City Insurer, Bond Counsel, Bank Compliance Officer. It looked like I was hunting a myth. I was hunting a habit. Carrie watched me and asked whether this was still about land. I told her it was about the language of respect. I told her that if we surrendered our line now, we would be tenants in our own lives. I told her I did not want a scene or a viral clip or an apology carved out of humiliation. I wanted paperwork that did not lie. I wanted the kind of neighbor revenge that left a record a judge could admire with his reading glasses low on his nose. She kissed my cheek and said she married a carpenter, not a soldier. I said that soldiers build too, sometimes. The camera recorded another plate at 11:02 p.m. The creek murmured, the red light blinked like a heartbeat. Bum, like a heartbeat I could aim. There is a point in any good American story where the serious music fades and something stranger slides in, like a carnival organ behind a hymn. That point came when the printer in my home office began to sound like a small engine. It ate reams of paper and spat out requests, notices, letters of intent, and exhibits. I named it in my head the American Dream Machine. I fed it coffee. I patted its warm flank like a good horse. The board in my garage thickened with yarn. It looked like a conspiracy, but felt like carpentry. Every string connected a weight to a brace so that nothing collapsed. On the left, the long, quiet column of my license plate logs. In the center, a printout of the American Land Title Association survey, with sharp little teeth where the mayor's painted lie crossed the true line. On the right, a calendar ticking down the days that mattered, hearing dates for the temporary injunction, the deadline in federal court for the city to answer, the due date the state gave for stormwater compliance, the day the bond disclosure had to be updated again. The board hummed like a beehive that makes honey from bureaucracy. If satire is just honesty with a grin, then the grin arrived when the Americans with Disabilities Act walked onto my board wearing a cape in my imagination. The city's sudden staff parking had no accessible space, no curb cut, no compliance with the most basic public accommodation obligations. I did not want to humiliate anyone by making a scene in the cul-de-sac. I wanted instead to email the city's risk pool and gently ask whether they were comfortable ensuring a non-compliant public facility on private land that belonged to a stubborn carpenter with a camera. The answer arrived as a conference call with 6 people who introduced themselves with long titles and spoke with the earnestness of people who had counted money and now feared subtraction. While the lawyers argued over lines, I began to count something else. I tallied each day of trespass at a fair market land lease rate and mailed a monthly invoice to the city marked rent for unauthorized use of 1,312 square feet at $2 per square foot per month. I included the time-stamped entries my camera had collected, which read like a ledger a judge could nap to and wake up nodding. I did not expect payment. I expected acknowledgement. What I received was better. I received silence that smelled like strategy meetings. The Environmental Protection Agency regional office, bless the slow grind of big wheels, copied me on a letter to the city that requested sampling, a stormwater pollution prevention plan, and proof of best management practices. I read that letter 3 times like a bedtime story to my grass. The city threw down temporary straw wattles and plastic, which is the municipal equivalent of a guilty shrug. The inspector returned and wrote more. Fines were discussed. The creek stripped oil from the asphalt swagger and displayed it like a museum exhibit for anyone with eyes, test strips, and a sense of humor. Insurance is the ghost in every American room that has money in it. The city's liability carrier sent a senior adjuster to walk the site with a clipboard that had looked heavier than wood. He eyed my camera. He asked whether my logs were accurate, whether my surveyor was licensed, whether I planned to amend my claim to include damages to landscaping. I said yes, and perhaps. He smiled like a man who prefers problems he can price. He took a photograph of the reserved parking city staff sign on my property and then took another from an angle that included my house number in the same frame. I do not know what he wrote later, but I know how I felt when he left, heard by a calculator that could rescue me from a man who understood only applause. On a Tuesday that smelled like cut lumber, a bank compliance officer called me. She worked for the institution that had purchased a tranche of our city's bonds. She had read the supplemental disclosure that described a minor parcel dispute and wished to understand whether minor meant do not worry or worry like an auditor. I explained the lis pendens, the federal civil rights claim, the ongoing environmental enforcement, the camera, the survey, the invoices. I explained that public integrity is not minor. I could hear her pen moving as if it had somewhere to be. She thanked me and said the bank would request additional assurances from the city before purchasing any further debt. I hung up and told my printer it was loved. This is where the story bent toward fantasy, not because it stopped being true, but because truth in America often looks like a Rube Goldberg machine that drops a marble at one end and produces a court order and a check at the other. The marble rolled across agencies, through compliance departments, around risk pools, under bond desks, and clicked a tiny bell in the newsroom of the county paper, where a journalist I had never met emailed me polite questions about a dispute over property used for parking. I answered only with documents. I did not give him quotes to make me sound brave or injured. I sent him timestamps and bearings. He wrote with restraint that made the mayor look like a man wrestling with nouns he could no longer bend. I did not want the mayor ruined. I wanted my land back and a lesson big enough to teach anyone who might come after him. Still, there is a part of the American spirit that thrills at accountability, and I am not better than my flag. In the nights before the hearing, I lay awake and watched the red camera light blink and imagined laws as characters gathering on my lawn. The Fifth Amendment wore a carpenter's apron and polished a square. The Americans with Disabilities Act flexed its ramp. The Clean Water Act checked the sky for rain and sharpened a pencil. The survey stood quiet and exact like a good soldier. Neighbor revenge, in that moment, felt less like vengeance and more like a parade where paper floats roll by and each one throws candy made of consequences. The mayor sent envoys. A council member suggested a community solution with landscaping and a plaque. A senior aide hinted at a job on a city committee that selects art for the library. A friend of a friend asked whether I could be magnanimous and accept an honor at the next town festival. I told each of them the same thing. I am not in the market for favors. I am building a staircase out of statutes, and the only thing I need is gravity. 2 days before the injunction hearing, mediation was proposed. We sat in a beige room where coffee tasted like the last 10 years of someone else's afternoon. Across the table, the city attorney wore a tie that wanted to be respected. The mayor wore a face that had learned to control its muscles. The mediator spoke in the syrup of neutrality. I presented the survey, the camera logs, the invoices, the letters from environmental regulators, the Title Insurance Council's opinion, the photograph of the reserved parking sign beside my mailbox. It felt like stacking lumber until the wall casts its own shadow. The city offered to pay for new sod and an ornamental tree. I pushed the stack forward a little so the shadow touched the mayor's cuff. The mediator exhaled through his nose like a man who loves outcomes more than optimism. I had one more card, not explosive but luminous. In the bond disclosure footnotes, the city had described the parking expansion as an on-site improvement adjacent to the annex. The plat filed at the county showed something different. It showed my parcel and a thin rectangle of deception. I did not threaten the Securities and Exchange Commission. I mentioned it as a natural weather system that arrives when disclosures do not match deeds. The bank officer's notes rustled invisibly in the air. The mediator suggested a break. In the hallway, I caught my reflection in a framed print of a bluebonnet field. I looked like a man who was learning that a country is a set of forms that love you back when you fill them out with care. When we returned to the table, the city attorney cleared his throat as if he had swallowed a cup of gravel. "We will propose a consent decree," he said, "and a structured settlement." The mayor stared at the table as if it were a map of a land where smiling had gone extinct. The carnival organ in my head hit a jaunty note. The marble rolled, and somewhere inside the machine a bell rang again. The final choreography did not involve spotlights, loudspeakers, or public scenes. It involved signatures and dates, the calm drumbeat of the very things that once tried to erase me. The consent decree filed in county court read like a garden hose that had been straightened, plain, useful, quietly powerful. The city acknowledged the true boundary, as established by the survey, vacated its painted invention, and recognized that any future use of my land would require my written consent with terms I could sing backwards. The decree required restoration, removal of asphalt, remediation of compacted soil, replacement of St. Augustine sod, and replanting of native shrubs along the creek. The Environmental Protection Agency letter followed with a compliance schedule for stormwater improvements at the annex, independent of my parcel, and the State Environmental Agency added a civil penalty that would fund a small grant for local creek cleanups, which pleased me like a coin dropped into a church plate by gravity itself. The structured settlement was more interesting and more American than any public apology. It established an easement that did not exist before, but not for parking. It was a conservation easement, drafted with language so clear it could be read by grass and children, protecting the back 10 feet of my yard and the creek bank from any development, public or private, for 30 years. The city paid a fair price for that easement, a number calculated by an appraiser who wore a tie that looked like homework. The money did not come as a single check. It came as a schedule, a first payment, a second upon full restoration, a third upon installation of a rain garden I had wanted for years but could not justify. The city also agreed to pay rent for every day of unauthorized use, At the rate I had been invoicing with a little multiplication for interest and a line for administrative respect, which is not a legal term, but read well in the recital. Because I insisted on a remedy that teaches, the decree created a parking education program that sounded silly until you read its teeth. Every city employee required to attend would learn about property boundaries, the Fifth Amendment's clause on taking without just compensation, stormwater basics, and accessibility laws for public facilities. It came with a quiz and a certificate they had to sign. The risk pool approved it with a note about reduced exposure. The mediator smiled in a way that made the beige room feel a fraction less beige. There was one piece that had the taste of neighbor revenge with a twist of mercy, because I wanted a story I could tell my son without grimacing. We built into the settlement a clause that allowed the city to pay a small stipend each year into a scholarship fund for seniors at Cedar Ridge High School who plan to study environmental science, construction management, or public administration with an ethics course included. The fund bears no names. It is simply called the Lines Matter Scholarship. The mayor's pen hesitated over that one. His attorney looked at the risk pool representative, who looked at a calculator somewhere in his mind and nodded. The pen moved again. I did not demand resignation. I did not demand a press conference. I did not demand that the mayor stand on my lawn and read a confession to the squirrels. I insisted instead on a letter. It is 3 paragraphs typed on city letterhead, signed by the mayor, and addressed to residents of Cedar Ridge. It explains what happened in a tone that lives somewhere between instruction and apology. It admits that an error in judgment led to an encroachment, that the city failed to secure proper permissions and comply with stormwater and accessibility requirements, and that the city is committed to a culture where property rights and public projects are not enemies. It lives on the city's website, behind a link titled Lessons Learned. I printed a copy and slid it into my binder, and for the first time the binder felt less like armor and more like an album. The asphalt came up like a bad dream being erased by daylight. Men I did not know ran machines that breathed hot tar and smoke. They rolled my strip and raked and tamped and laid sod with gloved tenderness, as if they had been told this grass could read. The camera watched without logging anyone's plate because there was no trespass left to measure. When the sprinkler hissed at dusk and the new green winked back at the oak, I felt the kind of joy that is not loud. It is measured. It is legal. It is mine. There was a final payment and an escrow letter that mentioned the federal court order that had started this ending by sliding across my table like a clean blade. The order, brief and stern, enjoined the city from using my property without due process and compensation. It sat beside the settlement papers like the spine under the muscle of our polite solution. If the city ever forgets again, the order will teach. People will ask whether I forgave the mayor. That is not the right verb for this. Forgiveness is for souls and dinner tables. What I felt was a different kind of respect, the kind that grows in the presence of consequence. He avoided the worst version of his future because I insisted on a better one for both of us. He will serve out his term and, I suspect, he will listen when a surveyor clears his throat in a meeting. He sent Carrie and me a handwritten note that said in neat letters that he had learned something he should have already known. I believe he meant it for the file cabinet of our lives, not for the newspaper. That is where it belongs. My neighbors adapted to the new story of our street. The woman with the trampled bluebonnets asked me over for coffee and told me she had read the consent decree like a thriller. The man who told me to be less intense brought me a six-pack and stood awkwardly on the sidewalk and used the word respect, the way a man uses a borrowed tool with care. The creek looked cleaner after a month of quiet rain and straw wattles placed where they belonged. The city installed a proper accessible space at the annex with a bright blue sign on city land, and the first time I saw an older veteran slide out of his truck and walk across that space like it was built for him, because it was, I nodded the way a carpenter nods when a tread does not squeak. On a Saturday in September, I built the rain garden behind the new sod. My son shoveled compost and asked whether laws were like lumber. I told him yes. He asked whether a mayor is just a neighbor with a title. I told him also yes, and that titles are dangerous when they make you forget the first yes. Carrie planted switchgrass and black-eyed Susan. The sprinkler hissed. Our oak held the light the way a big tree holds the memory of storms. I mowed the restored strip in straight lines so crisp they could have been read from the sky. The mower hummed. I thought about how close I had come to surrendering the quiet dignity of ownership to the loud convenience of someone else's agenda. Neighbor revenge, in my town and in my bones, does not look like shouting across a cul-de-sac or revealing a man's worst angle on 1,000 phones. It looks like statutes invoked in daylight, insurance policies stirring awake with their legal coffee, environmental letters printed on paper that makes promises and keeps them, and checks that arrive according to schedules no one can grin away. It looks like a consent decree you can fold and show your children, and a rain garden that holds a storm the way a good staircase holds weight. It looks like breathing easier when you see a boundary, not because it keeps people out, but because it teaches them how to come in. Every time I mow that patch of grass, I remember the first time my father stretched a string line and told me to trust it. I remember my printer working like a heart. I remember the red camera light blinking, the surveyor's tripod blinking back, the creek testing the city's conscience, the mediator counting the minutes, the bank compliance officer sharpening her pencil, the title insurance counsel with a dry chuckle, the inspector in boots at my fence, the mayor's pen hovering, then settling. I remember that a country is a language we speak together or not at all, and I remember that grass, if you treat it with respect, can read just fine.